This is Business Decoded podcast with Ronnie Spellman. An informal chats with top business moguls as they share their stories of failure and success in a fun and relaxed way. Get entertained, educated, and unlock the secrets to success.
Welcome to Business Decoded with Ronnie Spellman. We're back with a friend and guest, David Cabrales, who is an attorney and lobbyist for Foley and Lardner. David, welcome back.
Thank you, Ronnie. I'm glad to be back. After that last time, I wasn't sure you were going to let me back.
We ran out of time. I had much more to ask you and talk about, and I love that your legal practice centers on helping businesses resolve issues that they may have, and I think so many business owners really don't understand a future future issue that they might have to address, so they're not prepared to have someone like you ready to go when they face that issue. And so it's exciting to have you on to be able to talk about what you can do for businesses.
Well, thank you.
So you represent financial institutions, security brokers, dealers, retailers, and a variety of different businesses. Tell us what that looks like. Who is your typical client, if you have any? I know you might have various different clients across various different industries, but what does your typical client profile look like?
Yeah, you know, the type of client I represent will vary differently or dramatically between the work I do as a litigator and the work I do as a lobbyist, just because different audiences.
That's an interesting distinction, by the way.
Well, thank you. But with regard to even within the securities broker industry, one of my largest clients for a while, I don't do nearly as much work for them anymore. There was some acquisitions and whatnot, but they were what's known as a market maker.
Okay.
For NASDAQ traded stock. And so, and I didn't know the first thing of what a market, I mean, I had worked on a lot of securities work, industry type securities work, the backbone of the securities industry, but I had never handled a market maker's representation. And so I had to find out that, you know, we all know, okay, anytime you want to sell Apple stock, there's going to be somebody there ready to buy Apple stock, right? Because it trades in such high volume. There's a ready buyer for every seller. But for more thinly traded stock, there isn't always a buyer available whenever somebody wants to sell, or a seller available whenever somebody wants to buy. And so these market makers are set up to do exactly that. They make the market, right? So if you want to sell at that price, those shares, and they can't find a buyer, they'll buy it, not because they want to own it, but they want the transaction to happen, and then they'll hold it. And when somebody comes around and wants to buy some portion of that, they'll sell it to that person, right?
Interesting.
Or if somebody wants to buy more than they're holding, they'll sell short.
Right.
And then with the idea of they'll make it up the next time somebody wants to sell they'll buy the difference, right?
That is fascinating.
Yeah. So,
and so I worked in real estate, not to interrupt you there. I worked in real estate, and we have a lot of land bank organizations in the industry. I don't know if you're familiar with land banking, but these organizations will buy the land and hold it until one of the developers are ready to take it down. Yeah. And that sounds kind of similar, just someone to kind of hold the stock until it's ready for the next transaction.
And it's really, you know, the way they describe it, the word they use is they're creating liquidity in the market. You know, it helps the U.S. securities industry operate. If people know the day and moment I want to sell my stock in a publicly traded company, it will get sold, right? Mm-hmm. You don't want to get a call from the broker at the end of the day going, "Oh, bad news! I couldn't find anybody to buy your stock. We'll try again tomorrow." You're like, "No, I wanted to sell it today," and that's what a market maker steps in and does.
So you used to do a lot of work in that arena for this one company.
I did, and because they sell short, which is the kind of the thing that I got involved in. Anytime a thinly traded company's stock begins to go down in value, the principals in that company, the majority stockholders or the key insiders who own most of the stock, or let's say a large chunk of it, want to blame somebody for that, and it's other than their fundamentals, right? Other than their position in the market or their future prospects. And one easy candidate to blame are the short sellers, right? Their argument is, well, gosh, if you weren't selling my stock short, you know, you wouldn't scare everybody off, and my share price would stay, you know, kind of where I want it to be. And so a lot of litigation sprouted up, you know, 15 years ago, let's say, involving suing short sellers over what they were doing. And of course, there are a lot of people who sell short because they're making a bet against you, right? I mean, we all know that there are very famous. In fact, if you watch the movie The Big Short. That was the whole point, right? There was a handful of investors began to lose faith in the mortgage-backed securities market, and they were betting against it. They knew it was going to fail, and they were selling shares at a high price with an idea of buying those shares back and covering their trade. But a market maker, they're not making a bet on the direction the stock is moving, and they're just trying to keep the deal flow going. So our job was to get them out of those cases by being able to explain whatever you think the proprietary short traders were doing. These market makers were just keeping the deal flow going, right? And so we had varying degrees of success in trying to get them out. One of our big strategies was to take the cases to federal court under a jurisdictional provision in the Securities Exchange Act. And so, you know, it was a lot of fun, a lot of litigation all over the country doing that.
That is such a complicated place. So have you ever worked with the likes of a Carl Icahn or Michael Milken or any of those?
You know, only indirectly, because they were not them themselves, but people like that were some of the proprietary short sellers who really were trying to make a statement about what they thought about the worth of that company compared to what its stock valuation was. And so they were the people we were trying to separate ourselves from as a defendant whenever we'd get brought into those lawsuits.
That's an interesting place to work. Do you remember what happened with GameStop?
Podcasts are so popular, even monkeys are doing it.
75% of Americans listen to podcasts monthly. That's 210 million people in the United States alone. And yes, podcasts are profitable. Joe Rogan is making $30 million per year. Your content, your knowledge is worth sharing. Don't just dream it, do it. Visit andycostafilms.com/podcast and turn your content into leaks.
A couple years ago,
that was it. That was people trying to frustrate the efforts of short sellers. My son, of course, they were all pirates and heroes as far as he was concerned. I can say they're really devastating the marketplace because, you know, sometimes the stock really does need to be sold short because that's the wake-up call for the management team and the board that, hey, we need to do something different because our shareholders are not happy with the direction the company is going.
GameStop, that was a really interesting event that kind of turned things around.
Yeah, it made for a hell of a movie, too. If you haven't seen that movie, it's a lot of fun to watch.
Now, are you doing anything with the new Texas Stock Exchange that's coming? I know there's not a lot. They're still going through the regulatory process and the like, but that's a big deal.
You know, Jim Lee out of Houston is sort of the driving force. And another guy you ought to think about having on the show. Jim
I've spoken with Jim.
He would be a great guest to have. And we are watching it. There's some stuff we're doing legislatively that isn't directly on point with what he's doing, but is complementary of the effort that he is putting in to try to get that. I know there is some legislative work that probably needs to occur in order to maximize what they're hoping to have happen. And so, you know, the session's about to start in January, and then we'll hear from the governor in February about things that are priorities for him. I'm hoping and optimistic that getting that stock exchange up and running might be one of his legislative priorities, but we won't know that until we hear what he has to say.
So I promised the last year we would talk about your family, but I do want to mention this, just speaking about the Texas Stock Exchange. Texas is a special state. It's a big state, 8th largest economy in the world. You served on the Texas Economic Development Corporation.
I did.
Which is a really big deal.
Yeah.
Right? So you've been around that arena of trying to build the economic engine that's driving the state and our growth. Companies are moving here from all over the country and all over the world in many cases. What's your perspective? We have our own grid, our electric grid.
Which used to be a really good thing. That used to be a selling point when we would go around the world talking about Texas and economic development.
But tell me about that experience. So not only you're an attorney and a big-time attorney and you work with elected officials, but you worked on that corporation, that Economic Development Corporation, which is just an incredible group of who's who in business.
Yeah, so the Texas Economic Development Corporation is a nonprofit run out of the governor's office. So everybody who's on that board is appointed by the governor. It was created by state law. And so I first got involved in it when I was his general counsel. I became his point person on his portfolio of economic development tools that are housed within the governor's office, including the Film Incentive Fund and the Texas Enterprise Fund, among others, right? And then once I got done working for him, he named me to the board and ultimately elevated me to be its chairman. And so what the Texas Economic Development Corporation was doing at that time, and they still do it in a slightly different way with Governor Abbott, is we would go all over the country and internationally telling the story of Texas and what a great place Texas is to live and work, right? A great place to do business. And we would do it mainly by bringing the local economic development professionals. Every city and just about in Texas of any size has got economic development professionals working for it. And they know their labor force, they know their available real estate, they know their infrastructure, they know how far the nearest airports are and what their rail access is. I mean, they know everything there is to know about their communities. And so we would take a delegation of 6 or 8 of them on each of these trips, and the story of Texas was largely being told through the story of these communities, large and small, and everything that they had to offer, to prospective companies looking to expand or move into Texas. And then we would add on to that all of the typical Texas stuff, like, it's the 8th largest economy in the world, and we have, 1,100 incorporated cities, and we've got 11 deep water ports and 14 international airports, 6 flagship university systems, that kind of stuff. That was sort of our job to do, and it was a great time. I remember being in a meeting where Gavin Newsom, I think it might have been a state senator, he might have already been lieutenant governor at the time, and Governor Perry had brought them in, and they wanted to talk about what Texas does with economic development. And Gavin Newsom very jokingly said, I'm here because I'm tired of having you come to California and steal our jobs, right? That's jokingly, but with a glint of truth. And Governor Perry looked at him and said, it's not stealing if you're giving them away, is what he said. And so there was a little bit of that rivalry back and forth. But the governor, he was very candid in that meeting. And he said to the California delegation, he said, I wish the competition between California and Texas was better than it is in terms of the economic environment. He goes, because when California does well, America does well. And when California isn't realizing its potential as an economic engine, neither does the U.S. And so that was the sort of the parting shot that the governor left them with. I don't think they listened to him, because if you look, I don't know that they've eased up on some of their regulatory
that is so true.
Weight over there. But
and that's fascinating. So today, Texas has the largest number of Fortune 500 headquarters in the country. So it's now surpassed New York and California, over 55. And then a lot of non-Fortune 500 companies, but large companies that are headquartered here in Texas. Yeah. So I think Texas is winning that. Now we are the 2nd largest economy in the country, only behind California, just because they're so big. Yeah. And then in land, the 2nd only behind Alaska. But what we're doing here has just been incredible, and it thrived very well under Perry, and since then as well.
Well, I think the next frontier in corporations is trying to grow the number of states that are, the number of companies that are actually incorporated under Texas law. Right. And if you've been following what Delaware has been up to here lately, they've made some very sort of activist decisions, really kind of getting into the inner workings of business decisions being made by some of the companies that are incorporated in Delaware. And so it'll be interesting to see whether Texas seizes on that opportunity. Other states have already. Nevada is trying to do some things with its corporate laws to try to encourage companies to incorporate there as opposed to Delaware. But the thing that a place like Texas has that Nevada does not is everything you just described, in addition to maybe trying to create a very favorable landscape for companies to think about incorporating into. We've got all of the economic synergies you just described, given our size and our diversity in our economy.
So I know some of our listeners may have been thinking, especially in the last program, why are you having an attorney on the program? But you are such a business-focused guy on both ends through your law practice, but also in your expertise in helping businesses to thrive, which is what Texas has done a lot of. But Delaware, I want you to explain the Delaware piece, because most people, general people, might not realize that so many companies historically have been incorporated in Delaware, even if they have their main office in some other place. But why is that? Because that point you just mentioned about Texas trying to overtake that is really strategically important.
It is. And, Delaware has became the incorporation state of choice because they made a decision early on to create a system of chancery courts, which are really courts of equity, where business disputes about internal governance, disputes about management business decisions would be taken to the chancery court. And those courts historically have been staffed by judges, chancellors is what they call them, who have really become specialists in corporate law. And so when they make a decision in a case or in a dispute, they write a very lengthy opinion with a lot of explanation as to how they got to the decision they made. And those opinions sort of become part of the playbook for future decisions that companies might be making that are on point. And that had all worked very well for a long time, and no one gave it a second thought. If you were a major company, you wanted to be in Delaware because you knew you had the benefit of these chancellors and all of their expertise and experience. But here lately, there have been a handful of decisions that have just sort of broken with the tradition of what those chancellors typically do when it comes to evaluating what companies, how companies should be able to make decisions and how much second guessing. Because, the thing about a company's business decision, and you know this as a businessman, is you can't hold the board to the standard of, was that ultimately a good decision financially or not, right? A lot of business decisions don't go the way you hope they would. And that's and boards and companies shouldn't be penalized by shareholders for that. The question really was your decision infected with something external? Bias or an interest separate and apart from your decision and the judgment you were supposed to exercise as a board member or as a C-suite level officer. And so I think as Delaware continues the trend of wanting to revisit just the ultimate wisdom of a decision as opposed to whether it was corrupted by external forces, that opens the door for places like Texas. And I think we took the first step in a big way last session when we passed the business court bill. So now we have a business court. It isn't quite the Chancery Court, but it's designed to take this sort of dispute, if it involves a Texas company, into a specialized court where we will get written opinions that can be relied on going forward.
I'm glad that you mentioned. I was going to ask you to talk about the business court because it seems like it's moving in that direction. I have a friend who's appointed to the judge position in one of those business courts. And so it's a big deal in trying to navigate us towards that same infrastructure.
Yeah. And, they only started taking cases September 1. So they've got about 80, I think, right now. But, I think as companies and as lawyers begin to recognize the value of going to that court. And the interesting thing about the business court is we also created a standalone intermediate court of appeals that has a statewide footprint. And among the things that court of appeals gets is all of the business court cases. And so if you have a business court dispute in Houston or Fort Worth or Dallas or Austin that ends up going on appeal, it will go to the new 15th Court of Appeals. And then, of course, the Supreme Court is still available, but that's a court of discretionary review. They don't have to take your case in the Supreme Court. It has to be something that really affects the jurisprudence of the state in a meaningful way.
So that is interesting. I know that some would say in Texas you've got the Supreme Court that handles a certain set of cases, and then you've got the appellate court, which is kind of like the Supreme Court-ish on some of their decisions that can be final.
Yeah.
But walk us through what that looks like on those two systems. And then in the last program we discussed having a Supreme Court that's elected.
Yeah.
Tell us about what that means. And then, of course, how that impacts the business community.
Sure. So in Texas, all of our judges except the business court judges are elected.
Yes.
Right? Because we in Texas feel like the people ought to have the final say, and they're elected in partisan races, right? And so, any judge you're in front of, chances are if you voted, you either voted for them or you voted for their opponent if they had one. But the Supreme Court and the Court of Criminal Appeals and now the 15th Court of Appeals are unique in that they have to run statewide. And if you think about that, you're trying to get elected in a state of 30 million people, with 11 major media markets. I mean, there is just not enough money for a Supreme Court judge or a Court of Criminal Appeals judge to campaign in the way that we saw Ted Cruz and Colin Allred campaign. And they can't carpet bomb your TV with commercials. And so they have to do it the old-fashioned way. They jump on airplanes and they do, rubber chicken dinners, and they do, just Chamber of Commerce events. They'll go to legal events. They go to every bar association's gala, and bar is legal bar, not cocktail bar. They may go there too, but they're not canvassing for votes, and they have to just cover the state. They use a lot of surrogates, but and the other thing about it is because they are judges, they really can't. A politician can run on policy, right? I'm for this, I'm against this. If you elect me, I'm going to stop them from doing that. A judge has to run on things like, I'm going to move quickly. I'm going to be decisive. I'm going to be fair. I mean, it's very hard to fashion a message when you're running for judge because you have to remain impartial. And so they can't even talk about cases that might arrive in their court because they can't be seen as prejudging something that hasn't made it there. And so, it takes a really special type of lawyer to want to be a judge in Texas to begin with, but particularly to be a Supreme Court judge because they do get a lot of important cases put in front of them that matter tremendously.
And what's interesting about it, and then I definitely want to talk about your family, but what's interesting is that in some respects, it holds them accountable when they have to go back before the public and say, here's my body of work for re-election. In other places, they might be there for life in other states.
Yeah, well, our federal judges, when a president nominates and a Senate confirms a federal judge, they're on there until they decide to go or they get impeached. They can be impeached, but other than that, they're there till they die in office or retire.
And so many of our former Supreme Court members here in Texas going to become governor, as in Abbott, if I remember correctly, and Cornyn. Senator Cornyn was, I think, a Supreme Court judge as well,
and then Attorney General after that. Yeah, several of them have gone on to the Fifth Circuit and become Court of Appeals judges. One in the way back days actually got on the U.S. Supreme Court, and so there is a precedent. And so the question really is, do they want to continue wearing the robe? I can tell you, Judge Cornyn was a judge on the Texas Supreme Court when I was a baby lawyer working for Raul Gonzalez, and his hair was white already then. He got white hair very young in life because he had to have been about 40 when he was working, maybe 45 when he was a Texas Supreme Court justice. And we used to joke, because he's 6'3" and a mountain of a man with a booming voice and that white hair, and we would say there is no way with hair like that the Texas Supreme Court is his last stop. And so we would joke, we'd say he's either going to be a senator or a television evangelist, because there's no way that you would waste hair like that on the Texas Supreme Court. Luckily, he went into politics.
That's funny. The television evangelist would have been interesting.
Would have been something. I would have watched.
So tell me about one of your most complicated cases. I know you mentioned the Supreme Court just a moment ago, but what was your most fascinating case that you've managed?
Well, there's the big business lawyer case, and I was talking a little bit about short selling, and we had a case that ultimately went all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court that I like to think we would have won. But regrettably, in the period between when we had our oral argument in the U.S. Supreme Court and when it was decided, Justice Scalia passed away. And so I like to think if he had been around while they were talking about my case after the oral argument, he might have held the line. We ultimately lost 8-1, so I'm not sure my theory holds up. But I'll tell you, one of the most important cases I've handled is one that I'm just now finishing up. But at the request of a dear friend and a in-house general counsel here in Dallas, we got involved with some of his in-house lawyers in Alabama with a group called the Equal Justice Initiative. And that group's goal in Alabama is to try to improve the prison conditions in the state of Alabama. They have some of the worst prison conditions in the country, and they're perpetually being kind of looked into by the DOJ and other government regulators. So we took on the case of one inmate in one of the prisons who literally woke up one late afternoon while he was napping in his locked cell, being stabbed in the face by another inmate who was not his cellmate. It was just somebody else who had made their way into his locked cell. And so we brought a civil rights lawsuit in federal court on a pro bono basis, which means we're doing it for free. Had a ton of law firm lawyers pitching in a little bit, in order to try to make that possible. And we ultimately ended up reaching a successful monetary resolution of that lawsuit, even though that sort of case is very hard to prosecute and keep, because there are so many procedural safeguards that make those cases dismissible at very early stages, and we survived a few of those dismissal points and got to the point where we were actually able to sit down and negotiate in a mediation a resolution of that. And so, you know, it was just one inmate and it was just one incident, but it's sort of we feel like in order to get the attention of the leadership in the state of Alabama with regard to their prison systems, it's probably going to be one case at a time. And
so you actually work that case specifically as a business attorney. You were working.
Well, I'm a litigator
rights.
too, right?
I know.
So I was playing litigator in that. I was the lead lawyer, and it was my job mainly to go recruit volunteer Foley lawyers to actually help me get it done, because there was a lot of work to be done. But I flew to. I went to 5 different Alabama prisons because my client got moved around that many times during the course of the lawsuit, just to meet with them, you know, understand the case and to handle discovery, get him ready for his deposition, you know, that sort of thing.
That's incredible.
Yeah.
Well, this has been absolutely phenomenal. But aside from being a big-time attorney and working on a lot of economic development items for the state and traveling the country to help an inmate with a civil rights issue, what do you like to do? I know that you have a family. And by the way, I recently, my daughter and I, we've been watching Suits together.
Yes.
It's made a comeback on Netflix. And it's been fascinating to watch a guy become an attorney and claim that he attended Harvard Law School.
Yes.
It's been fun. I don't know if you watched the show or not.
So let me tell you about, I won't talk about Suits specifically, but I'll tell you that my wife will not let me watch lawyer shows with her.
Okay.
Because I spend all my time explaining, like, that's not how we pronounce that word, and that actually wouldn't happen just yet. We'd have to do these other things. And she's like, well, you ruin every lawyer show we ever watch, right?
That's
so
funny.
Fast forward, my wife is she works for the state of Texas, and she regulates radioactive materials for the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality. So there's a big West Texas radioactive waste disposal site. That's one of her permitted sites, and she's got other things that she does. So we're sitting there watching, a couple of years ago, the show about Chernobyl. If you remember, they made a Netflix show about Chernobyl. And after about 45 minutes, she looks at me and says, I understand now the frustration you feel when you watch lawyer shows. She goes, because there's like 4 things I've already seen that are not like it is in the real world of radioactive materials. I said, see?
That's
so
hilarious.
I rarely get to watch lawyer TV shows. I do enjoy watching television with my wife, but she really skews toward obscure foreign TV. So we watch a lot of British shows and Scottish shows, but those have become too mainstream for her. So now we've got TV shows that were produced in Finland that we're watching, and the Netherlands and Denmark and Norway. And so, you know, Netflix has really opened the door to being able to watch, you know, stuff from other parts of the world. Ironically, one of my kids is in college in Scotland. And my wife has a cousin there, and so we were down there visiting my daughter and her cousin and her cousin's wife, and we were talking about all these great British shows that we watch. They haven't seen any of them because they spend all their time watching American television. So we really had very little to talk about when it came to TV because we're watching different stuff.
So how did your daughter end up there for college?
You know, it had nothing to do with going to Scotland, believe it or not. So that particular daughter of mine is an artist. And she wants to get into the computer game industry. She wants to be the artist that creates the universe that you play a game in, right? The backdrop, the scenery, the props, the characters. And so she was looking around, and there's a university in Scotland that was the first in the world to develop a degree plan, a 4-year degree plan for computer games back in the 90s. And if you've heard of the game Grand Theft Auto, it actually came from that school. Students who had come out of that school back in the 90s actually developed that game. And so, you know, she applied there, she got in. I have a rule at my house that you're going to go to a Texas public institution unless you get a scholarship to offset the difference in what it would cost. Everything worked out well, and so she met that requirement, and off she went to Scotland. It just worked out through happenstance that my wife has a cousin who lives there, and we've got some adult presence keeping an eye on things. It's been a lot of fun.
I used to work in the video game industry, so I worked at a company that we had a lot of people that started at Atari. I mean, we were a third-party developer for video games, but we had an office in the UK and India, and it's a neat place to be. Just the the creativeness of those people. So the people that are not only doing the engineering and the software development, but the art people.
That's it. Yeah.
That you know they draw this amazing artwork, and then the engineers make the artwork move and create those environments.
Yeah. No, and that's what she wants to be. She wants to put her art, to work in that area. Now I got to ask you a video game question. Yeah. What video game were you the best at ever in your life? What was your peak? What was your peak video game prowess?
Well, so I played I had an Atari 2600.
Yeah, I remember that, man.
And so I enjoyed the Pac-Mans. I still do.
Yeah.
The space game that we used to play, Pongo, I think was one of the Pong was one of the games. No, and then we got into the Madden games, and those came out. So the football games used to play that, and then I think it was the Mike Tyson boxing game. So I am still
you
an old
really
school.
Are a video game guy. You went through different platforms and different.
Frogger was a lot of fun back then.
No, you see, I peaked at Asteroids. If you remember Asteroids,
I remember.
And part of it was because I was a paper boy. I was earning my own money, and I'm like, why am I feeding this machine all these quarters?
Right.
And so once the novelty of Asteroid wore off, and I was pretty good at it, I wasn't going to invest what it took me to get that good at Asteroids for Galaga or Space Invaders or any of that. So I tapped out at that point and really have not been, other than playing some Wii with my kids when they were younger, I left the video game world and never looked
back. We
did
a lot of that as well. And then my office was around the corner from Blizzard, which was owned by Activision, and they're a big video game developer, Call of Duty and a bunch of other games. And so I never played the Angry Birds. That became really, really big. But.
Well, there was a game in the 80s when I was in college that you played it on the Apple. Remember the old Apple that was one unit, the Macintosh?
Yes.
The Macintosh, not the Apple. And it was called Balance of Power. And it was basically the Soviet Union versus the U.S. And it would develop a scenario, and then you had to make a decision on what you wanted to do in response to that scenario. If you were the U.S. or Russia, whoever you were playing. And then if you were playing against somebody, then they would make a decision on what to do. And it was all about trying to gain world support vis-a-vis the other country, but without so offsetting the balance that you would trigger a nuclear war, right? So you would make your decision, then the program would run, and it would show you these headlines and like the how the world would respond. Like they would denounce you as a dictator or whatever, or as trying to build an empire or whatever. And you would play, and the goal was to see how many rounds you could play before you accidentally triggered nuclear war because one or the other of you fell so far behind. But
now, when my daughters were little and games started moving to mobile, one of the games I played often with them because it was really simple was paper toss. So you have to toss this little piece of paper into a trash can.
Much different than Balance of Power.
It is. We weren't trying to figure out the world geopolitical space, but I suspect your daughter probably went abroad because you did something really neat in raising them. And it sounds like you took that from your father on your travel around the country. And I think so many people miss those little abilities to travel. And it doesn't cost a lot to travel across the country. We have some amazing sites here in the U.S. But you probably gave them that ability to think creatively and explore and to challenge themselves to learn more about the world.
Right. Well, and so what you're talking about is that when I was a kid growing up, my dad was a civil servant. When we would go on vacation in the summer, we would we would load the car up and hitch the trailer to the back, and we'd go on a road trip, right? And we'd go west more often than not because we lived in El Paso. But a few years we would go east. Sometimes we would kind of go northwest up into some of the national parks. But it was a road trip. I mean, you were parking, you were setting the trailer down, you were kind of staying in the trailer, and then off to somewhere else, right? And so when it was time for me to start taking my own kids on vacation, the road trip part of it stuck with me. And so I don't tow a trailer. That I did once, and that would to suboptimal results. But we do, I'll just sort of pick a general direction that I want to go, and maybe some event or some relative we're going to see along the way. And then after that, it's just a matter of, what does that part of the country have to offer? And so we've gone. One summer we went as far as Milwaukee, and that was a baseball road trip. We saw 4 baseball games in 4 different baseball parks in a week. And so our first stop was in St. Louis to see the Cardinals, and then we went to Chicago and saw a game in each of the 2 stadiums, and then we made our way to Milwaukee and saw a Brewers game, and then started making our way back. And along the way, I learned something. I had no idea, and I don't know how I didn't know this, but I didn't realize that Abraham Lincoln was buried in Illinois, in Springfield, right? I just and I guess that makes sense because Arlington hadn't come together yet, right? It came together after the Civil War. And so as I'm looking at what to do in Springfield, I realized, oh my gosh, Abraham Lincoln. So I had already taken my kids to see where John F. Kennedy was laid to rest. So one of my daughters, the one who's in Scotland, is like, well, Dad, how many presidents have been killed while they were president? Not just died, but actually been killed. There have been 4 of them, right? And she's like, well, where are the other 2 buried? And we looked it up, and they're both in Ohio, I think. So she's like, well, I'm halfway through the assassinated president final resting sites. I'm like, I'm not sure that's a collection. I said, but yes, you are halfway through it. But, so, just the thing about actually getting in a car and driving, like I told you when we were talking earlier, there's a lot of downtime, and you just have to make the best of it as a family. You have to talk or share decisions about music or whatever. And then you see a lot of places you're never going to see if you just fly to your destination. And so that has stuck with me. I don't know if the next generation will keep the tradition, but that's certainly the way I like to travel.
And that's an amazing experience. I think you mentioned as a kid, you visited a lot of state capitals.
Isn't that crazy? Yeah, for no other reason than my dad thought those are important buildings. You need to know what's going on in there. And so I've seen a lot of them. None of them compare to the one in Austin. Boy, the Texas State Capitol is still the best.
It is amazing. I was in Michigan not long ago, and I visited their state capitol, and I have an amazing appreciation for the state capitol in Texas. It's the largest, I think, in the country. State capitol.
It's a great place to see.
David, thanks for joining us again. It's been a pleasure having you on both programs. This one has been a lot of fun just as well. So I appreciate you coming.
Ronnie. I appreciate it. Thank you for all your hard work, sir. And thank you.
Thank you for joining us on Business Decoded with Ronnie Spellman.
Thank you for listening to Business Decoded podcast with Ronnie Spellman. Please be sure to subscribe and share, and stay tuned for more incredible Business Decoded episodes.